Hey, what's up guys, aarava here, and welcome back to a brand new video here today, and welcome finally to my reaction to the 2020 Mercedes Formula 1 car, the W11. I know it's been a few days, obviously we had a bit of a schedule change after all the crap that happened on my channel on Friday, but we're finally getting to the reigning world champions car, and probably the car to beat this season again, you would say. I mean, as much as Ferrari and Red Bull have looked really decent, you've got to say Mercedes always will come with the pedigree, and obviously the favourite to end the season, basically, and the car looks pretty damn awesome in terms of the changes they've made aerodynamically. They've really tried to bolster what their weak points were. The car was, you know, maybe not necessarily the best in a straight line. Ferrari definitely had that over them, and even the chassis maybe was a little bit poor here and there, but the car was great at keeping its tyres in check, and, you know, little things just needed to change to make it a world beater, basically. I think they've kind of gone for that, and so I think they will be as strong as ever in 2020. But livery-wise, let's just talk about that. Aesthetics-wise, it was an interesting launch for Mercedes. They actually launched the livery a few days early on an old chassis, and it looked, at least in my opinion and loads of people's opinions, absolutely gopping, because they put a splash of red on the front wing and the engine cover for a brand new sponsor. But even the rest of the livery itself, like, you know, the usual turquoise Petronas lines were just very, very odd, very minimalistic, but it just doesn't work on the old chassis. I must say, though, I will admit, on the newer chassis, on the actual 2020 car, definitely does look a lot better. I still prefer last year's livery. I think it looks a bit better, a bit more finesse, I guess, in the artistry of it all, but obviously it's not, it's all going to look the same when it's flying around at 180 miles per hour in the corners, especially those turquoise lines. So that's my opinion on the livery. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. But let's now dive into the actual tech side of things and see what Mercedes have subtly changed in some areas and quite aggressively changed in others to make the car the one to beat in 2020. So we're going to start off looking at the front end of the car. So the front wing itself hasn't really changed too much dramatically, but I feel like they have subtly changed it a little bit with the angle of the way the flaps taper into the outboard part of the front wing to maybe go for a halfway house. Mercedes and Red Bull were very much on one end of the spectrum last year, and Ferrari and Alfa Romeo, teams like that, were on the other extreme end, where the wings tapered very much downwards to the edge of the end plate of the front wing, whereas Mercedes and Red Bull had them kind of more higher up and having that outwash effect. Mercedes seemed to have lowered it just a tad, just to kind of get a kind of good middle ground, I guess. Obviously, I think for Ferrari that works quite well for them, obviously, in terms of that kind of concept, and as you'll see later, Mercedes changing the way their side pods are shaped. Perhaps that's what they wanted to go for, a bit more philosophy of getting air more inboard than outboard, rather, in terms of getting the air turned towards bargeboard area rather than outside of the front tyres to kind of structure up that wash, the terminal wash off the front tyres. But we move forward to the nose cone itself, very similar to last year. They've gone for that same sort of very thin cape, if you will, rather than a snowplow, I guess. A little bit awkward in terms of the way it actually connects onto the front wing. But of course, I'm sure they've obviously looked at the kind of actual airflow around that and thought that was okay. But I would suggest that maybe Mercedes will probably change that entire front arrangement at some point in the season. They love to do that. Merc have always been one of the teams that constantly change the actual nose profile throughout the season, depending on what they want to go for. Maybe the high downforce configuration. We've seen so many times the actual nose tip itself change from a flatter nose to a much larger one, a smaller one, a more wider one. So we'll see if that's going to change throughout preseason testing. Perhaps Mercedes have said this year they are not going to bring a B-spec car to testing. Last year we had that kind of the case of the Mercedes looked quite barren in week 1, and then week 2 it looked like a completely different car, and then obviously we rocked up to Australia and it was obviously it was much better than Ferrari and much better than we all expected to. This year Ferrari are the ones that are saying they're doing that, so I don't know, does that say confidence, I guess, for Mercedes in terms of what they've made, or perhaps they're saving some goodies for Australia? I'm not too sure. I think it's more confidence, to be honest, because I think last year, as the season went on, they quickly realised their car is actually really decent at holding the tyres, which is so crucial. So it's all just about adding a bit of, kind of efficiency to the chassis or the aero, or trying to obviously get the car as efficient as possible in a straight line. Whereas getting the tyres right, as you can see by teams like Haas and Ferrari at times, is very difficult. It's hard to get a car that works well with its tyres. It's hard to turn a car into a car that's good on its tyres halfway through the season, compared to if you start foundationally with that, it's easier to just work on the aero side of things and the chassis side of things, vice versa, because it's a bit of a black art, really, the kind of whole tyre heating, keeping the tyres alive mid-race, obviously over a stint of a Grand Prix. So I think Merc are kind of quietly confident in that kind of way of saying they're not going to bring a B-spec car, but of course it's Mercedes, so remember, they always like to lie and sandbag, so you never know, they might bring a completely different car to testing a week 2, we'll have to see. But we move on higher up on this picture of the car front on, and we're going to look at these side pods, because that is is probably the biggest change of this entire car, is finally Mercedes have opted for the philosophy that many teams have been going for now, which is the Ferrari, Red Bull kind of concept of very skinny side pod inlets, trying to sucker in the side pods as much as they can. Merc last year launched their car with very odd, large inlets compared to every other team. They're actually noticeably larger at the launch spec pictures compared to this year. Now they've finally gone for that concept, so I guess that was maybe where they were lacking compared to Ferrari, perhaps, in terms of the thinner the side pods are, there's just more space for the air to actually flow through over the sides onto the floor and then through to the diffuser to ultimately create rear downforce and also create that entire efficiency at the rear end of the car. So Merc finally going for that. In terms of the uprights and the barge wheel area, that's all very similar to what they had from Abu Dhabi last year, so I suggest that may change in pre-season testing or to Australia, but for now it's very much the spec they had at the end of last year, and obviously they didn't really need to change it too much. You know, when you get to the top teams, it's maybe not going to be massive changes to the barge wheel areas because they would have obviously tried to get to a point where they feel it's the best possible area in Abu Dhabi, so that's not really going to change too much dramatically. Merc have kind of gone for their own style always compared to Red Bull and Ferrari with the lack of the kind of X-Wing style fighter pilot winglets, and they've gone for a more connected approach down to the uprights they've got to the barge wheel areas. But the actual side pods itself, you can see just very much so tiny inlets compared to last year. If you look directly at comparison photos, you'll see the difference there, and so you can also see the actual shape of the Coke bottle shape of the side pod going to the rear end of the car also dramatically thinner, and you'll see on other photos how much they've actually shrink wrapped this entire thing in terms of, like with the Williams car, which I alluded to, that copied the Mercedes kind of approach. Mercedes have pretty much tighten this thing up to the point where you can almost see the radiators kind of poking out in terms of the way they kind of actually shape the bodywork around it. So it's rather than the actual carbon fiber and everything shaping the side pod from the outside, it's the internals of the Mercedes engine and the internals of the Mercedes radiator that actually have created the shape of the side pod, which is just showing how dramatic and how far they're going for those extra few percentages of efficiency and also the airflow to the rear end of the car. If we look on from a diagonal side profile, you can really see that shrink wrapping going on. If we just move through to a picture without the white lines, without the yellow lines, and then back to this photo, you can see what I mean, that you've got that kind of crease and dent over the Petronas logo, and that's where the radiator is housed on the roof of the side pod structure. Like I said with Williams, copying that kind of style because they've got the same similar sort of dent, but maybe not as dramatic as Mercedes. That's not really going to be for cooling. It's really literally just going to be for the shape of the side pods, trying to get that as thin as possible because they create a massive undercut under the side pod inlet. So if you follow where my mouse is, you know, kind of along where the turquoise line is, essentially Mercedes have a nice turquoise painted line where they want the airflow to go, essentially, because where that line is, they're hoping to create a massive gap, which they have done, like the other teams like McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull are trying to do, but Merc are really taking it to another extreme of trying and push in the bodywork as well inwards to the engine cover as much as they can. The same thing with the end of the car. They've had, for the last 2-3 years, I would say, at least 2 years for sure, they've had these few little bumps and blisters on the engine cover, and those have been just to make sure the engine parts kind of have enough space to work with. But this year at the rear end, especially at the bottom of where you'll see the numbers on the shark fin, they've gone even more extreme. You now not got just blisters, you've got literal full tapings of bodywork. We can see they basically shrink wrapped it around all the tubing, all the kind of outlets, or any bits and bobs they've got on the engine side of things. So Merc going as extreme as possible to create airflow through from the side pod to the rear end of the car and make that as efficient as possible. Of course, straight line speed wasn't the kind of biggest characteristic of that car last year compared to Ferrari, so will that affect things in terms of cooling, perhaps, in terms of have they done anything clever in the architecture to maybe make sure cooling was a thing, because that definitely was an issue sometimes for Mercedes, I feel, in terms of maybe they couldn't wind up their engine as much as they would like to because of cooling, so maybe they've done some clever things there to also change it around to make it as efficient as possible, to therefore shrink wrap the engine cover as the way they have done, essentially. And finally, looking at a nice on-track photo from Hamilton shaking down Mercedes at Silverstone. Instead, again, you can just see the different kind of things picked out here on the car. Starting from the front end, again, that cape, that snowplow effect with a very odd connection to the front nose, but I've kind of pointed out the way this nose straightened up very much so, but again, they might reprofile that. They've got that usual S-start with the fins that a lot of people now have copied Mercedes from. You know, last year it was kind of Mercedes, Alfa Romeo, and Red Bull were the only teams really with these little nostril fins where the S duct is to try and channel the flow exactly to where they want, or try and get flow away, any turbulent flow away from the S duct. And so a lot of teams have copied that approach. So you'll see just more midfield teams copying what the top teams are doing, of course. And so the top teams have less to do, really. But like I said, the whole bargewood area kind of similar in terms of, apart from, like I said, with the inlet, it does mean they've actually moved for the kind of crash structure and the way that works. So this is definitely more defined than it ever was last year for Mercedes, this pillar right here. And they've copied the exact same as most of the teams have done now, where the crash structure, the actual mandatory crash structure, is built into this pylon. So they're not really wasting any space. And also they're able to push back the side pod just a tad and then shrink it down and create that undercut effect, which will allow as much air to flow from that bargewood and side pod area to the rear of the car. And you can see again that nice Coke bottle shape really defined underneath that Petronas Primax logo then. And then circling just where the 44 is, you can see those kind of bulges and blisters just even more prominent than they ever were last year, as they really try and tighten up the bodywork there. That is the Mercedes car. Not a massive load, I guess, to look at, but the things they have changed are pretty major, and the biggest one obviously is the side pod. That was always a thing. Mercedes always seemed so stubborn not to go that route for the last 2-3 years, really, but now they've finally kind of taken that approach, and maybe that's the final step they feel to become an absolute world beater, like I said. And for me, it's unfortunate to say, but I still think they'll be the team to beat. Of course, they're going to be the one hitting the ground running, but obviously we all hope that Ferrari and Red Bull can also give them a good fight. And to be fair, from the videos I made on Ferrari and Red Bull, especially Red Bull, I think there's some hope, but obviously we won't know until well, not even pre-season, we won't know until Australia, because obviously pre-season last year was so, completely the opposite to what we had at Australia. So I think a lot of us fans are going to be able to just look at the times and just not read too much into it, because last year we all got kind of hoodwinked, basically, or I guess half as good hoodwinked. The other half kind of didn't believe how good Ferrari were looking in pre-season. So yeah, definitely take everything with a pinch of salt. But that's the Mercedes W11 car, analysed and also my opinions on the livery. So like I said, let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. Do you think Merc will be the team to beat? And also, what do you make of the livery? Let me know. If you did enjoy the video and find it informative, then be sure to hit the like button. If you are new around here to subscribe for weekly full-on content, I've been aarava. Have a good day. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.